Hello, welcome to a new lockdown video. Today we are going to talk about how to teach. I think we would all agree that we should teach communicatively. But the thing with the communicative approach or CLT is that it's an approach, not a method. So it doesn't give us steps to follow. Instead, it's a set of principles that should guide the decisions we make. So let's go back in time for inspiration. Beginning with the grammar translation method, that was the method used to teach Latin, and Latin was a language that was not spoken, it was just written. So the whole lesson was based on written forms, and they used the mother tongue to teach. They had a deductive approach. This means that students were taught the grammar, the rules, and hope that they would pick up the language later on. So the emphasis was on usage rather than on use. And they believed that grammar was, what they did with grammar was split it into pieces and sequence them in an order that students could learn. About the beginning of the 20th century, the direct method emerged as a reaction against the grammar translation method because they believed that that was not okay. So they would go to the other side, the opposite, expose students to oral language, to the use of the target language, the second language exclusively. The mother tongue was not allowed at all because they had this inductive approach, like students were exposed to the language and they would pick up the grammar sometime later on. And the only problem with this one, they focused on use, but it was unrealistic. They used classroom language mainly and sentences like the pencil is on the table that students would not use in real life situations. So they didn't consider real life language, just classroom language. In the 50s, more or less, the audiolingual method emerged, especially when they realized that people were not being able to communicate. This was this came together with world wars because a lot of people needed to communicate and they couldn't. At this time, there were two very strong theories, a linguistic theory, structuralism, and a psychological theory, behaviorism, that influenced this method. And the big thing about this method is repetition. So students would be exposed to longer dialogues than before. The inductive approach is still present, and they would repeat, even without understanding, and they would create the idea of knowing the language. But it's not the way we understand communication nowadays. So from then on, there was like a turning point at about more or less in the 70s, when I was born. There was this big thing in the whole world, like they really realized that people were not being able to communicate freely. So the functional notional approach, and now from now on, they're all approaches, no more methods really. They said that it was necessary to decide on some situations that students would have to be able to deal with and speak, and they focused on the four skills, pretty much like the way we see them nowadays. And they came up with this idea of threshold level, which means the minimum language that students are supposed to master in order that they can say that they speak the language or they know the language. The threshold level includes language functions, like what they can do with the language, like talking about routines, describing people, ordering a meal in a restaurant. So this was from now on, all the approaches add to something, but they still don't tell us how to teach. The natural approach is a very interesting contribution, also in the 70s, from Stephen Krashen, and he kind of tries to explain the way in which we learn languages. There are 5 hypotheses that we need to consider. The acquisition learning hypothesis, that he says that acquiring the language is something natural, spontaneous, that happens when we are exposed to the language, as opposed to learning that is like studying the language, like the things we do when we are taught consciously. The natural order hypothesis refers to the fact that some bits of language are learned before others. For example, it's easier to learn the S of the plural and not the S of the third person singular. So plurals should be taught before, definitely. The monitor hypothesis refers to all the language that is learned, when we teach the language explicitly, all that knowledge goes to a kind of monitor that students can use only when they have time to focus on what they are saying or writing. and it doesn't necessarily apply to communication when we are not paying attention. The input hypothesis refers to the fact that we learn the language when we are exposed to comprehensible input. This is language that is a little bit above our level of production, so we can understand but not produce yet. And together with the input hypothesis, he mentions the silent period that I referred to in another video, that we are exposed to this input and a long time later, little long, depending on the person and the context, we can start producing. And finally, the affective filter refers to the role of emotions in learning. If a person is under stress and, for example, feels embarrassed to talk, the affective filter goes up and they don't learn. So to summarize, we can say that students learn a language because they are exposed to it in an environment that is not stressful for them. Together with this natural approach, we can mention the total physical response technique. This is a kind of technique that takes these ideas from Krashen's theory. But, well, TPR is a bit more for children, and as I said before, our course is based on adolescents or adults, so we're not going to go so deep into this. So, as a conclusion, we can say that teaching is deciding. I said this in the first video. And whatever method or technique or activity we decide to use in the classroom will be okay if we consider our students, the content, the school we're dealing with, our own experience, our preferences. And if our goal is to teach students to communicate, and that activity, method, or tool is a means to that end, is welcome. And, well, so there's no specific way to teach. It's the teacher who should decide. Okay, I hope this is useful. I recorded this video like 20 times.